Well, hello, my friend. Thank you for listening in to My Christian Thoughts, episode one. Um, I hope you had a really awesome day today. I had a very productive day, which is great. It's always really encouraging and motivating when you have a day where you really feel like you accomplished a lot of stuff. So it was a good day. Um, So, but anyways, I really hope your day was great. Thank you for listening in again. So what is the point of this podcast? Basically, this is just where I'm going to dump all of my thoughts and things that pass through my head that I feel the need to let out and articulate, because I find that talking my thoughts out makes them way more concrete and easy to understand. Because I think a lot of times our thoughts, they're more abstract than we think they are. They're I'm going to put it this way. A lot of times my thoughts are they're almost like color. And there's this big swirling kind of mesh of color that's representing something that I'm feeling or something that I'm thinking. But I can't really quite put my finger on it until I actually articulate it. But then when I articulate it and voice it out, like I do in videos or on Instagram or whatever, at Christian_Jude_H, shout out, shameless plug. I need a little sip of water. My voice gets dry really quickly. I also like to talk, so that doesn't help. But as soon as I talk things out, everything makes a lot more sense. So thank you for listening. This intro was way too long. Let's just get right into what I wanted to talk about. So the topic that I wanted to discuss is the idea of vice and virtue, and what they are and how it functions and what we can do to further get ourselves closer to a virtue and kind of away from vices. And you know what? The truth of the matter is, first of all, is that everybody has different vices that they tend to lean toward. One thing for somebody that they have full control over, another person really, really struggles with. And I think as we progress through life and as we develop and grow, we're constantly on this journey to try to get to temper those vices and kind of balance them out. But let's talk about vice and virtue, their definitions. So a virtue is, in reality, or a casual way of explaining it, is any good thing or good feature that you have, or an admirable personality, or more so a character trait. I think that would be the best way to put it, is some sort of admirable character trait that we might have. And then you have a vice, which is people tend to always think of vices as just being something that they struggle with. Vice has a little bit more of a nuanced definition than just something that we struggle with, or a quote-unquote demon. A vice is when you have a virtue, but it's a complete, on the left side of the spectrum, you have a deficiency of that virtue, and that's a vice. And generally, we tend to think of there being a spectrum of vice and virtue where you have vice on one end and virtue on the other end. That's really not the case. It's actually a lot more like a sliding scale, because just as much as you can have a deficiency of a virtue, on the other end of the spectrum, you can have an over, I don't want to call it an overabundance, but it's an excess of the virtue, where you're not really. It's a perverted form of the virtue. I mean, both vices are perverted forms of the virtue, but on the right side, it's an excess. It's too much of it. So virtue, therefore, is finding this balance between these two deficiencies, rather between the deficiency and the excess. It's finding that middle ground, just like most things are in life. Most things require a balance. You can't really deprive yourself of things, and you can't have an excess of things. You have to find a balance, and it's the same way with parts of your character and parts of your person. So I'll give you an example. A really good example is courage. So courage I think most people, I think everybody honestly would admit that courage would be a virtue. It's a good thing. Knowing in the face of fear, being able to act sensibly in the face of fear is virtuous. It's a good thing. It's admirable. Well, if you think of this deficiency, you have cowardice. So when you feel the fear, you immediately, instead of sensibly reacting to the fear, you let the feeling of fear determine how you act. Okay? Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you can have too much courage, which I guess I would call that recklessness, where you feel fear, and instead of sensibly responding to it, you immediately act, typically in an aggressive way, even if it's not sensible and you're not using your brain, because it's really not running. It's not like fight or flight are vices. Fight or flight is actually knowing to flee or to fight would be a virtue because it's sensible. The whole idea of virtue is that in any given situation, you know what to say and what the right thing to think is, and then you respond in the best way given the situation. That's what virtue is. So, for example, if I saw a burglar stealing a woman's purse on the street, cowardice would mean I run away from it and I just try to save myself and I don't try to think of any other greater good besides just my own self. Recklessness could be immediately going in and trying to fight this guy. Well, virtue of courage would say, okay, let's examine the situation. First of all, does this guy have a weapon? Could he kill me? B, let's size this guy up. Is he bigger than me? Is he a lot stronger than me? Maybe not. Okay, so in that case, if he doesn't have a weapon and he's not stronger than me, and I seem to be a bit faster than him, I'm going to try to chase this guy down. That's a reasonable thing to do in that situation. Or let's say he is bigger than you and he has a gun. The most sensible thing to do in that situation would be to call someone who can take care of it, to call the authorities. So that would be the virtue of courage acting and use it being sensible. The really difficult thing about all of this is that it's very, very easy to live in the extremes, to live in the vices. And I think the reason is because the vices are always dependent on emotional response. So in case of courage, fear and cowardice, you feel the fear and you immediately respond to the fear. You don't act despite the fear. Whereas on the other side, you have recklessness, where you feel the fear and you immediately feel like you need to act on your own accord. So it's always emotional, and I think that's really with anything. for someone who struggles with eating, there's that balance between, the virtue would be learning how to listen to your body. That's virtuous, and eating what your body's telling you it wants. And then on one end, you have starving yourself. And then on the other end, you have, being a glutton. Well, on either of those sides of the spectrum, I think there's definitely there's a lot of potential for an emotional response. Maybe they're starving themselves because they're anorexic. They don't like the way they look. They're ashamed of themselves. They're addicted to being a certain weight. Whereas on the other side, you're a glutton, and, sometimes people eating makes them happy, and that's the only thing that makes them happy. So they eat a lot of food. I can vouch for that because I've been on both sides of that spectrum, for various reasons. But I'm trying to find that middle ground and learn how to say no to food that I don't need. And even harder for me is to say, Christian, you need to eat more food. You need more protein or whatever. And that's been just as tough as saying no to food, if not tougher for me. So your whole journey is learning how to find this balance. But I guess the question is, how do we learn what that balance is? Well, Aristotle, who kind of brought up this whole idea of virtue ethics, would say, well, it's really easy. You look at a virtuous person and see how they act. Well, that's kind of a tough thing, but it makes a lot of sense because, humans are naturally monkey see, monkey do creatures. And, we learn by observing in our surroundings. Well, the problem is you have to ask, where did that person learn to be virtuous? And then you have the turtles all the way down type scenario where, well, where did they learn? Where did that person learn from? Well, he learned from this person. Well, where did they learn from? And da-da-da-da. Well, then you get into the really interesting thing, whereas like Thomas Aquinas would take Aristotle's theory and said, this is really good, but we need to come to an end point here. And then we understand, the way we understand God is that God is the good. He is goodness. That's part of his being, is that he's goodness. So all virtue is really derived from him, because all goodness, anything good, is reflective of him. So, in all those situations where we don't know what that middle ground is between the two vices, we should always be consulting God on those things, because he is ordered and he is organized and he is that goodness and that middle ground, and he understands that middle ground, and he can impart that onto us. He doesn't want to hide those things from us. Jesus said, knock and keep on knocking. I don't know exactly which letter it's from, but there's a verse that says, God doesn't want to keep wisdom from you. If you ask for it, he will give it to you. That might have been from the gospel. Oh boy, I'm going to get yelled at now. But, if we're asking God, I need help finding this balance between starving myself and overeating or being super lazy when you study or when you work. That's another really tough one. Being completely lazy and then being a complete workaholic where you've invested your whole life is just your work. And how do you find that middle ground where you work and you want to do a good job, but you also realize that your work isn't your life? That's another tough thing, especially I think Americans deal with how performance-based our society is. So we really need to consult God on these things, and he'll tell us, and he's going to help us with it. If we're deficient somewhere, he's going to give us the willpower to kind of push toward the middle. If we're in excess of something, he's going to give us the strength to kind of hold back. And he will do it, but we have to ask him for it, and we have to ask him to help us with those things. So I hope you got something out of my little rambling session, my Christian thoughts. Thank you for listening again. Make sure to hit subscribe If you're listening to this on YouTube, I don't really know where else it would be, considering I'm only going to put it on YouTube. Follow me on Instagram at Christian_Jude_H. I'm working on a lot of things right now. I don't just podcast. I'm writing music and modeling and all this other good stuff. So if you want to follow me in all my endeavors, go ahead and follow that. So thank you, my friend. I hope you have a really wonderful day, a blessed day. And if you're listening to this at night, I pray that you have a wonderful sleep and a restful sleep. God bless you. Keep an eye out for the next podcast. Thank you.